eyes to see, and the quickest to harm a stranger are the soonest to think a stranger will harm them. This fellow, I believe he might sell his mother to Trollocs for stew meat if the price was right. I'm a little surprised you ask. I heard the way people in Emmons Field speak of those from Tarn Ferry.
Yes, but, well, everyone says they... But I never thought they would actually...
Rand decided he had better stop thinking that he knew anything at all of what people were like beyond his own village.
He might tell the Fade we crossed on the ferry, he said at last. Maybe he'll bring the Trollocs over after us.
Lan chuckled dryly. Robbing a stranger is one thing. Dealing with a half-man something else again. Can you really see him ferrying Trollocs over, especially in this fog? No matter how much gold was offered? Or even talking to a Murdro, if he had any choice? Just the thought of it would keep him running for a month. I don't think we have to worry very much about dark friends in Tarn Ferry. Not here. We are safe. Honestly. From this lot, anyway.
Fairway.
Watch yourself. Hightower had turned from peering into the fog ahead. Pointed face pushed forward and torch held high, he stared at Lan and Rand as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Deck planks creaked under the hauler's feet and the occasional stamp of a hoof. Abruptly, the ferryman twitched as he realized they were watching him, watching them. With a leap, he spun back to looking for the far bank, or whatever it was he sought in the fog. Say no more, Lan said, so softly, Rand almost could not understand. These are bad days to speak of Trollocs or dark friends, or the father of lies with strange ears to hear. Such talk can bring worse than the dragon's fangs scrawled on your door. Rand felt no desire to go on with his questions. Gloom settled on him even more than it had before. Dark friends? As if Fades and Trollocs and Drakkar were not enough to worry about. At least you could tell a Trolloc at sight. Abruptly, pilings loomed shadowy in the mist before them. The ferry thudded against the far bank, and then the haulers were hurrying to lash the craft fast and let down the ramp at that end with a thump, while Matt and Perrin announced loudly that the Tarn was not half as wide as they had heard. Lan led his stallion down the ramp, followed by Moraine and the others. As Rand, the last, took Cloud down behind Bella, Master Hightower called out angrily, "Here now! Here! Where's my gold?" "It shall be paid," Moraine's voice came from somewhere in the mist. Rand's boots clumped from the ramp to a wooden landing. "And a silver mark for each of your men," the Aes Sedai added, "for the quick crossing." The ferryman hesitated, a face pushed forward as if he smelled danger.
Fairway.
But at the mention of silver, the haulers roused themselves. Some paused to seize a torch, but they all thumped down the ramp before Hightower could open his mouth. With a sullen grimace, the ferryman followed his crew. Cloud's hooves clumped hollowly in the fog as Rand made his way carefully along the landing. The gray mist was as thick here as over the river. At the foot of the landing, the warder was handing out coins, surrounded by the torches of Hightower and his fellows. Everyone else except Moraine waited just beyond in an anxious
Nice
cluster.
swing you got there.
The Aes Sedai stood looking at the river, though what she could see was beyond Rand. With a shiver, he hitched up his cloak, sodden as it was. He was really out of Two Rivers now, and it seemed much farther away than the width of a river. "There," Lan said, handing a last coin to Hightower. "As agreed."
Ha!
He did not put up his purse, and the ferrety-faced man eyed it greedily. With a loud creak, the landing shivered. Hightower jerked upright, head swiveling back toward the mist-cloaked ferry. The torches remaining on board were a pair of dim, fuzzy points of light. The landing groaned, and with a thunderous crack of snapping wood, the twin glows lurched, then began to revolve. Egwene cried out wordlessly,
Nice
and Tom
shot.
cursed. "It's loose!" Hightower screamed. Grabbing his haulers, he pushed them toward the end of the landing. "The ferry's loose, you fools!
Yes!
Get
Approach and amazing.
The haulers stumbled a few steps under Hightower's shoves, then stopped. The faint lights on the ferry spun faster, then faster still.
Yes!
The fog
birdie.
above them swirled, sucked into a spiral. The landing trembled. The cracking and splintering of wood filled the air as the ferry began breaking apart. "Whirlpool," one of the haulers said, his voice filled with awe. "No whirlpools on the Tarn." Hightower sounded empty. "Never been a whirlpool." "An unfortunate occurrence." Moraine's voice was hollow in the fog, and made her a shadow as she turned from the river. Unfortunate,
Fairway.
Lan agreed in a flat tone. It seems you'll be carrying no one else across the river for a time. An ill thing that you lost your craft in our service. He delved again into his purse, ready in his hand. This should repay you.
Bravo.
For a moment, Hightower stared at the gold glinting in Lan's hand in the torchlight. Then his shoulders
Fairway.
hunched and his eyes darted to the others he had carried across. Made indistinct by the fog, the Emmons fielders stood silently. With a frightened, inarticulate cry, the ferryman snatched the coins from Lan, whirled, and ran into the mist. His haulers were only half a step behind him, their torches quickly swallowed as they vanished upriver.
Nice.
There is nothing further to hold us here, the Aes Sedai said, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Leading her white mare, she started away from the landing, up the bank. Rand stood staring at the hidden river. It could have been happenstance. No whirlpools, he said, but it...
Good par.
Abruptly, he realized everyone else had gone. Hurriedly, he scrambled up the gently sloping bank. In the space of 3 paces, the heavy mist faded away to nothing. He stopped dead and stared back. Along a line running down the shore, thick gray hung on one side. On the other shone a clear night sky, still dark, though the sharpness of the moon hinted at dawn not far off. The warder and the Aes Sedai stood conferring beside their horses a short distance beyond the border of the fog. The others huddled a little apart.
Good job,
Even in the
yeah.
moonlit darkness, their nervousness was palpable. All eyes were on Lan and Moraine,
Rough.
and all but Egwene were leaning back as if torn between losing the pair and getting too close. Rand trotted the last few spans to Egwene's side, leading Cloud, and she grinned at him. He did not think the shine in her eyes was all from moonlight. It follows the river as if drawn with a pen, Moraine was saying
Nice
in
swing you got
satisfied
there.
tones. There are not 10 women in Tar Valon
Fairway.
who could do that unaided, not to mention from the back of a galloping horse. I don't mean to complain, Moraine said Tom said, sounding oddly diffident for him. But would it not have been better to cover us a little further? Say to Berlon?
Green.
If that Drakkar looks on this side of the river, we'll lose everything we have gained. Drakkar are not very smart, Master Merlin, the Aes Sedai said dryly. Fearsome and deadly dangerous, and with sharp eyes, but little intelligence. It will tell the Myrddraal that this side of the river is clear, but the river itself is choked for miles in both directions. The Myrddraal will know the extra effort that cost me.
In.
He will have
Nice.
to consider that we may be escaping down the river, and that will slow him. He will have to divide his efforts. The fog should hold long enough that he will never be sure that we did not travel at least partway by boat. I could have extended the fog a little way toward Berlon instead, but then the Drakkar could search the river in a matter of hours, and the Myrddraal would know exactly where we were headed. Tom made a puffing sound and shook his head. I apologize, Aes Sedai. I hope I did not offend. Moi. Aes Sedai. Matt
Nice.
stopped to swallow audibly. The ferry, did you... I mean, I don't understand why... He trailed off weakly, and there was a silence so deep that the loudest sound Rand heard was his own breathing. Finally, Moraine spoke, and her voice filled the empty silence with sharpness. You all want explanations, but if I explained my every action to you, I would have no time for anything else. In the moonlight, the Aes Sedai seemed taller, somehow, almost looming over them. Know this. I intend to see you safely to Tar Valon. That is the one thing you need to know. If we keep standing here, Lan put in, the Drakkar will not need to search the river. If I remember correctly... He led his horse on up the riverbank. As if the warder's movement had loosened something in his chest, Rand drew a deep breath. He heard others doing the same, even Tom, and remembered an old saying. Better to spit in a wolf's eye than to cross an eye's ground.
Yes.
If tension had lessened, Moraine was not looming over anyone.
Fairway.
She barely reached his chest. I don't suppose we could rest a bit, Perrin said hopefully, ending with a yawn. Egwene slumped against Bella, sighed tiredly. It was the first sound even approaching a complaint that Rand had heard from her. Maybe now she realizes this isn't some grand adventure after all.
Fairway.
Then he guiltily remembered that, unlike him, she had not slept a day away. We do need to rest, Moraine said he said. After all, we have ridden all night. Then I suggest we see what Lan has for us, Moraine said. Come. She led them on up the
Green.
bank into the woods beyond the river. Bare branches thickened the shadows.
A good 100 spans from the tarn, they came to a dark mound beside a clearing. Here, a long-ago flood had undermined and toppled an entire stand of leather leaves, washing them together into a great thick tangle, an apparently solid mass of trunks and branches and roots. Moraine stopped, and suddenly a light appeared low to the ground, coming from under the heap of trees. Thrusting a stub of torch ahead of him, Lan crawled out from under the mound and straightened. No unwelcome visitors, he told Moraine. And the wood I left is still dry, so I started a small fire. We will rest warm. You expected us to stop here? Egwene said in surprise. It seemed a likely place, Lan replied. I like to be prepared, just in case. Moraine took the torch from him. Will you see to the horses? When you are done, I will do what I can about everyone's tiredness. Right now I want to talk to
Fareway.
Egwene? Rand watched the two women crouch down and disappear under the great pile of tree trunks. There was a low opening, barely big enough to crawl into. The light of the torch vanished. Lan had included feed bags and a small quantity of oats in the supplies. But he stopped the others from unsaddling their horses. Instead, he produced the hobbles he had also packed. They would rest easier without the saddles, but if we must leave quickly, there may be no time to replace them. They don't look to me like they need any rest, Perrin said as he attempted to slip a feed bag over his mount's muzzle. The horse tossed its head before allowing him to put the straps in place. Rand was having difficulties with Cloud, too, taking 3 tries before he could get the canvas bag over the gray's nose. They do, Lan told them. He straightened from hobbling his stallion. Oh, they can still run. They will run at their fastest if we let them. Right up to the second they dropped dead from exhaustion they never even felt. I would rather Moraine Sedai had not had to do what she did, but it was necessary. He patted the stallion's neck, and the horse bobbed his head as if acknowledging the warder's touch. We must go slowly with them for the next few days until they recover. More slowly than I would like. But with luck, it will be enough. Is that... Matt swallowed audibly.
Ouch.
Is that what she meant?
Bogey.
About our tiredness? Rand patted Cloud's neck and stared at nothing. Despite what she had done for Tam, he had no desire for the Aes Sedai to use the power on him. Light. She as much as admitted sinking the ferry. Something like it, Lan chuckled wryly. But you'll not have to worry about running yourself to death, not unless things get a lot worse than they are. Just think of it as an extra night's sleep. The shrill scream of the Drakkar suddenly echoed from above the fog-covered river. Even the horses froze. Again it came, closer now, and again, piercing Rand's skull like needles. Then the cries were fading until they had faded away entirely. Luck, Rand breathed. It searches the river for us. He gave a quick shrug and abruptly sounded matter-of-fact. Let's get inside. I could do with some hot tea and something to fill my belly. Rand was the first to crawl on hands and knees through the opening in the tangle of trees
all
and
right,
down a short
let the
tunnel.
master do the work.
At the end of it, he stopped, still crouching.
Don't abuse your club so
Ahead
much.
was an irregularly
But
shaped
then
space,
again,
a woody
likes
cave
company.
easily large enough to
So,
hold them
yes, abuse your
all. The roof
clubs.
of tree trunks and branches came too low to allow any but the women to stand. Smoke from a small fire on a bed of river stones drifted up and through. The draft was enough to keep the space free of smoke, but the interweaving was too thick to let out even a glimmer of the flames. Moraine and Egwene, their cloaks thrown aside, sat cross-legged facing one another beside the fire. The one power, Moraine was saying, comes from the true source, the driving force of creation, the force the Creator made to turn the wheel of time. She put her hands together in front of her and pushed them against each other. saidin, the male half of the true source, and saidar, the female half, work against each other and at the same time together to provide that force. saidin, she lifted one hand, then let it drop, is fouled by the touch of the Dark One, like water with a thin slick of rancid oil floating on top. The water is still pure, but it cannot be touched without touching the foulness. Only saidar is still safe to be used. Egwene's back was to Rand. He could not see her face, but she was leaning forward eagerly. Matt poked Rand from behind and muttered something, and he moved on into the tree cavern. Moraine and Egwene ignored his entry. The other men crowded in behind him, tossing off damp cloaks, settling around the fire and holding hands out to the warmth. Lan, the last to enter, pulled water bags and leather sacks from a nook in the wall, took out a kettle, and began to prepare tea. He paid no attention to what the women were saying, but Rand's friends began to stop toasting their hands and stare openly. Tom pretended that all of his interest was engaged in loading his thickly carved pipe, but the way he leaned toward the women gave him away. Moraine and Egwene acted as if they were alone. "No," Moraine said in answer to a question Rand had missed. "The true source cannot be used up any more than the river can be used up by the wheel of a mill. The source is the river, the Aes Sedai, the water wheel." "And you really think I can learn?" Egwene asked. Her face shone with eagerness. Rand had never seen her look so beautiful or so far away from him. "I can become an Aes Sedai." Rand jumped up, cracking his head against the low roof of logs. Tom Merrilin grabbed his arm, yanking him back down. "Don't be a fool," the Gleeman murmured. He eyed the women. Neither seemed to have noticed, and the look he gave Rand was sympathetic. "It's beyond you now, boy." "Child," Moraine said gently, "only a very few can learn to touch the true source and use the one power. Some of those can learn to a greater degree, some to a lesser. You are one of the bare handful for whom there is no need to learn. At least touching the source will come to you whether you want it or not. Without the teaching you can receive in Tar Valon, though, you will never learn to channel it fully, and you may not survive. Men who have the ability to touch saidin born in them die, of course, and if the Red Ajah does not find them and gentle them..." Tom growled deep in his throat, and Rand shifted uncomfortably. Men like those of whom the Aes Sedai spoke were rare. He had only heard of 3 in his whole life, and thank the light, never in the Two Rivers. But the damage they did before the Aes Sedai found them was always bad enough for the news to carry, like the news of wars or earthquakes that destroyed cities. He had never really understood what the Ajahs did. According to the stories, there were societies among the Aes Sedai that seemed to plot and squabble among themselves more than anything else. But the stories were clear on one point. The Red Ajah held its prime duty to be the prevention of another breaking of the world, and they did it by hunting down every man who even dreamed of wielding the one power. Mat and Perrin looked as if they suddenly wished they were back home in their beds. "But some of the women die, too. It is hard to learn without a guide. The women we do not find, those who live, often become... Well, in this part of the world, they might become wisdoms of their villages." The Aes Sedai paused thoughtfully. "The old blood is strong in Emmonsfield, and the old blood sings. I knew you for what you were the moment I saw you. No Aes Sedai can stand in the presence of a woman who can channel, or who is close to a change and not feel it." She rummaged in the pouch at her belt and produced the small blue gem on a gold chain that she had earlier worn in her hair. "You are very close to your change, your first touching. It will be better if I guide you through it. That way you will avoid the unpleasant effects that come to those who must find their own way." Egwene's eyes widened as she looked at the stone, and she wet her lips repeatedly. Does that have the power?" "Of course not," Moraine snapped. "Things
Heavy rough.
do not have the power, child. Even an Angreal is only a tool. This is just a pretty blue stone, but it can give off light. Here." Egwene's hands trembled as Moraine laid the stone on her
Greenside
fingertips.
bunker.
She started to pull back, but the Aes Sedai held both her hands in one of hers and gently touched the other to the side of Egwene's head. "Look at the stone," the Aes Sedai said softly. "It is better this way than fumbling alone.
Yes,
Clear
approach
your mind
and
of everything
amazing.
but the stone. Clear your mind and let yourself drift. There is only the stone and emptiness. I will begin it. Drift, and let me guide you. No thought. Drift." Rand's fingers dug into his knees. His jaws clenched until they hurt. She has to fail. She has to. Light bloomed in the stone. Just one flash of blue, and then gone. No brighter than a firefly, but he flinched as if it had been blinding. Egwene and Moraine stared into the stone, faces empty. Another flash came, and another, until the azure light pulsed like the beating of a heart. "It's the Aes Sedai," he thought, desperately. "Moraine's doing it, not Egwene." One last feeble flicker, and the stone was merely a bauble again. Rand held his breath. For a moment, Egwene continued to
Fairway.
stare at the small stone. Then she looked up at Moraine. I thought I felt something, but perhaps you're mistaken about me. I am sorry I wasted your time. I have wasted nothing, child. A small smile of satisfaction flitted across Moraine's lips. That last
Wow,
night
that was
yours
great.
Alone. It was? Egwene explained.
Fairway.
Then slid immediately back into glumness. But it was barely there at all. Now you are behaving like a foolish village girl. Most who come to Tar Valon must study for many months before they can do what you just
Fantastic.
did. You may go far. Perhaps even the
Good
Amelin
approach.
Peak one day. If you study hard and work hard. You mean... With a cry of delight, Egwene threw her arms around the Aes Sedai. Oh, thank you. Rand, did you hear? I'm going to be an Aes Sedai. Chapter 13.
Tar.
Choices. Before they went to sleep, Moraine knelt by each in turn and laid her hands on their heads. Rand grumbled that he had no need, and she should not waste her strength. But he did not try to stop her. Egwene was eager for the experience, Mat and Perrin clearly frightened of it, and frightened to say no. Tom jerked away from the Aes Sedai's hands, but she seized his gray head with a look that allowed no nonsense. The Gleeman scowled through the entire thing. She smiled mockingly once she took her hands away. His frown deepened,
Fairway.
but he did look refreshed. They all did. Rand had drawn back into a niche in the uneven wall where he hoped he would be overlooked. His eyes wanted to slide closed once he leaned back against the timber jumble, but he forced himself to watch. He pushed a fist against his mouth to stifle a yawn. A little sleep, an hour or two, and he would be just fine. Moraine did not forget him, though. He flinched at the coolness of her fingers on his face and said, I don't...
Greenside
His
bunker.
eyes widened in wonder. Tiredness drained out of him like water running downhill. Aches and soreness ebbed to dim memories and vanished. He stared at her with his mouth hanging open. She
On
smiled
green.
and withdrew her hand. It is done, she said, and as she stood with a weary sigh, he was reminded that she could not do the same for herself. Indeed, she only drank a little tea, refusing the bread and cheese Lan tried to press on her, before curling up beside the fire. She seemed to fall asleep the instant she wrapped her cloak around her. The others, all save Lan, were dropping asleep wherever they could find a space to stretch out, but Rand could not imagine why. He felt as if he had already had a full night in a good bed. No sooner did he lean back against the log wall, though, than sleep rolled him under. When Lan poked him awake an hour later, he felt as though he had had 3 days' rest. The warder awakened them all, except Moraine, and he sternly hushed any sound that might disturb her. Even so, he allowed them only a short stay in the snug cave of trees. Before the sun was twice its own height above the horizon, all traces that anyone had ever stopped there had been cleared away, and they were all mounted and moving north toward Baerlon,
Fairway.
riding slowly to conserve the horses. The Aes Sedai's eyes were shadowed, but she sat her saddle upright and steady. Fog still hung thick over the river behind them, a gray wall resisting the efforts of the feeble sun to burn it away, and hiding the two rivers from view. Rand watched over his shoulder as he rode, hoping for one last glimpse, even of Tarn Ferry, until the fog bank was lost to sight. I never thought I'd ever be this far from home,
Wow,
he said,
that
when
was
the trees
great.
at last hid both the fog and the river.
Hazard.
Remember when Watch Hill seemed a long way? 2 days ago, that was. It seems like forever. In a month or two, we'll be back, Perrin said in a strained voice. Think what we'll have to tell. Even Trollocs can't chase us forever, Mat said. Burn me, they can't. He straightened around with a heavy sigh, slumping in his saddle as if he did not believe a word that had been said. Men, Egwene snorted. You get the adventure you're always prating about, and already you're talking about home. She held her head high, yet Rand noticed a tremor to her voice, now that nothing more was to be seen of the two rivers. Neither Moraine nor Lan made any attempt to reassure them, not a word to say that of course they would come back. He tried not to think on what that might mean. Even rested, he was full enough of doubts without searching for more. Hunching in his saddle, he began a waking dream of tending the sheep alongside Tam in a pasture with deep, lush grass and larks singing of a spring morning. And a trip into Emmons Field and Beltane the way it had been, dancing on the green, with never a care beyond whether he might stumble in the steps. He managed to lose himself in it for a long time. The journey to Bearlawn took almost a week. Lan muttered about the laggardness of their travel, but it was he who set the pace and forced the rest to keep it. With himself and his stallion Mondarb, he said it meant blade in the old tongue, he was not so sparing. The warder covered twice as much ground as they did, galloping ahead, his color-shifting cloak swirling in the wind to scout what lay before them, or dropping behind to examine their back trail. Any others who tried to move at more than a walk, though, got cutting words on taking care of their animals, biting words and how well they would do afoot if the Trollocs did appear. Not even Moraine was proof against his tongue if she let the white mare pick up her step. Aldib, the mare was called, in the old tongue, West Wind, the wind that brought the spring rains. The warder's scouting never turned up any sign of pursuit or ambush. He spoke only to Moraine of what he saw, and that quietly, so it could not be overheard. And the Aes Sedai informed the rest of them of what she thought they needed to know. In the beginning, Rand looked over his shoulder as much as he did ahead. He was not the only one. Perrin fingered his axe often, and Mat rode with an arrow knocked to his bow in the beginning. But the land behind remained empty of Trollocs,